in Spanish. So to access that interpretation tool, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of the navigation screen. We will also have a Q&A, question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So I encourage you to please use the Q&A function again that is located at the bottom of the navigation bar. Before we continue, I always think it's important to take a moment to give some words of gratitude for the day. And so maybe let's just take a moment to do that. In komonesh kabantoshihak likutank limusikech utlisham. Let's give thanks for the day, the air, and the light. And we pray for wisdom and knowledge to guide us today, for all days, but especially for today. Thank you. My name is Monica Koch Magnuson. I am Maya Etchi from Southern Belize. I am also the Director of Advocacy and Policy here at Cultural Survival. As some of you may know, Cultural Survival is a 50-year-old Indigenous rights, Indigenous-led organization based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cultural Survival has curated a robust network of partnerships with Indigenous communities spanning over 70 countries on 6 continents. Our work is predicated on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, where we work to empower Indigenous peoples as they strive to assert their self-determination and their rights to self-determination and to sustain their lands, cultures, and vital ecosystems. We have staff in over 29 staff in over 10 countries, and our staff is majority women and majority Indigenous. We've been doing these trainings on human rights instruments for over 10 years, both in person and virtually. So we're happy that we are able to continue to do this. If you want to learn more about the work that we do here at Cultural Survival, I encourage you to please visit our website at wwcs.org. And thank you again for joining us for this webinar. As you know, we are here today to learn more about international human rights mechanisms, including the Universal Periodic Review and UN treaty bodies, the high-level political forum on sustainable development, along with other human rights mechanisms, and how they can aid in your advocacy efforts and how you can put pressure on governments at the local level, the national level, and also at the global level in order to promote respect for Indigenous people's rights. And joining me here today for this webinar is Mr. Joshua Cooper. He will be doing that presentation for us today. And he is the Executive Director of Oceania Human Rights and the Dean of Global Leadership Academy for Human Rights based in Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. Cooper is an academic, an advocate, an author, an analyst, and an activist based out of Hawaii. He's held positions of Senior Global Advocacy Manager, Senior Director of Communications and Community Engagement, Senior Director of Global Governance and International Initiatives, Senior Director of Research, Policy, and Law with multiple people's movements, NGOs, and Human Rights Defenders Association. He is a human rights advocate engaging in global and regional mechanisms. He has participated as an official observer at the United Nations meetings in both the Charter and treaty bodies of the human rights machinery for over a decade. So Joshua comes to us with a wealth of knowledge, and I'm excited to hear more about what he has to share with us today. So Joshua, welcome and thank you for being here. The floor is yours. You have about half an hour. Thank you.
Aloha, and thank you so much, Monica. It's wonderful to see you again. I also want to thank all of the amazing advocates at Cultural Survival, beginning with Agnes, for all that you do throughout the year. It is an honor to be with everyone here at the 21st session of the UN Permanent Forum. It's very important. It's actually the first time that everyone's allowed inside the building. since it was closed in March of 2022 that NGOs, the ambassadors, of course, have been in, but it's the first time that we, civil society, indigenous peoples, are able to be inside the chair and be inside the meeting. Of course, we're still doing all of our side events virtually, which is a little bit interesting because we're now missing all of Agnes's great snacks that we'd be enjoying if we're at the church center or another great location. But it's still very satisfying, and we get to feed our hunger intellectually by sharing about the important issues that exist. And when people come to the Permanent Forum, I know we all prepare. We all do all of this amazing consultations, communicate with our communities, and say, what do you want us to bring? And we know now that today's Wednesday, and in 2 days, the forum will conclude. And you might have given an intervention, you might have hosted a side event, and then you say, what next? Well, the good news is there's many avenues for advocacy. And what we'll share with you today are just 3 main avenues that you can then begin to advocate at. And there's many more, but we thought the Universal Periodic Review is important. It's important for a couple of reasons that I'll suggest. One is there's a calendar. The 4th cycle will begin in October, November, and it'll go for 4.5 years. So if you're saying, I have issues, I wonder when I could bring them up, you can locate on that calendar the dates between 2022 to 2026. So this also allows you to plan better. You can look at what your priorities are, look at what you want to accomplish, and then really organize, as we'll talk about, 5 different phases of planning and campaigns that really can grow your movement. The other space is the treaty bodies. And there are 9, sometimes people say 10 if you count the subcommittee on torture, but those are treaty bodies. And what's good about them is they're experts that have been appointed to implement these important international human rights instruments on the ground in the nations that we find ourselves in today. So on one example, the United States will be reviewed at something known as CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So we're preparing for that, but there's 8 other amazing themed human rights reporting bodies that do review a country for a very long time. So it's one that we can prepare. The only bad part is you don't have 4 or 5 years to plan. You get usually 6 months to a year. And then the last one that we're looking at is something known as the High-Level Political Forum. The High-Level Political Forum focuses on sustainable development goals. So we can use the chat a bit and be more interactive. How many people have heard about sustainable development goals? The exciting part is 42 countries every year sign up to participate in July and be able to say how they're doing on the 17 global goals. So looking at what we'll be talking about today, I'll roughly try to spend 10 minutes on each theme: the UPR, the treaty bodies, and the high-level political forum / the voluntary national review. And what we'll do then is have a conversation afterwards of, you can say, how would I go about it? What can we do? And Cultural Survival, we'd love to be able to assist you in this phase, because the good news is there's sort of a pattern. When you look at the human rights, there are international instruments, be it human rights that are covered under the UPR, be it specific treaties from women's rights under CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and also the voluntary national review, which focuses on the sustainable development goals, those 17 goals. And we'll try to cover all those if everyone would like that. And so we're so glad you joined us here on the 2nd week of the Permanent Forum. And I was actually just at a meeting with the ambassador of a country who's going through their voluntary national review. It's a very small country, so it's really good to partner with them and just brainstorming, because even what he said is when we go under the reviews, we want to be doing something. And that's usually the case. When a country gets reviewed, even if they might not be great to us all the time, when a review comes up, that's a chance for us to put moral, political, legal pressure on our governments that too often ignore us to make sure that they implement what they've already agreed to under international human rights law. So The Universal Periodic Review is known as I call it the gateway drug to human rights for a couple of reasons. One, the UPR covers everything you could imagine under human rights. The UN Charter, which was adopted in San Francisco in 1945, anything in the UN Charter. And the UN Charter has the right of self-determination, which is so valuable for indigenous peoples. It also has mention up to a half a dozen times about human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the exciting part is we can coordinate and organize on that and be able to make sure that you can raise almost any of the issues that you're facing. The second is anything that the nation had actually ratified. So this is where we can talk about the treaty bodies and then revisit them later on in the program. There are 9 core human rights treaties. There, of course, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's important because it has civil and political and economic, social, cultural rights. It talks about the right to vote, the right to be innocent until proven guilty, but also the right to housing, healthcare, education, all those important economic, social, cultural rights as well. Then there's the treaties. The treaties cover the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the ICESCR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Those both treaties, some of your countries have ratified both of those. But then it looks at CERD, which I described earlier, because the US will be reviewed, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And then there's also the CEDAW that we talked about earlier, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. There's the CRC, Committee and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which every country in the world has ratified except for the United States. So the exciting part is you can definitely engage and talk with any of these treaty bodies. And there's also a very important one that we're looking at, and that is the Convention on Enforced Disappearances, the Convention on Migrant Workers, and the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and also the Convention Against Torture. So any of those issues you can pursue. But the exciting part about the UPR is you might have been reviewed, but maybe the country hasn't done anything, you can raise that there. And then the last couple areas, there's something known as the special procedures or the rapporteurs. And the rapporteurs or independent experts or working groups, they also are very active and they might visit your country or they might write a thematic report. You can revisit anything they said to put pressure. So the exciting part about the UPR, also humanitarian law, if you're in a country where the military has been evicting indigenous peoples from their sacred homelands or defending the water or sacred mountains, you can also use humanitarian law as well under the UPR review. So you can see it's the most all-encompassing. It allows us to bring up any issue that maybe you couldn't bring up in another space. So the Universal Periodic Review is that. In the end, it's a 3.5-hour review of every country in the world on how they're doing on human rights. In a way, many people are now in finals and school's ending. It is a final exam for countries to say how they're doing on human rights. And so that is the Universal Periodic Review. What I'll share with you is 5 stages, because it could be a bit overwhelming if you're like, oh my gosh, where do I start? The exciting part is we begin in first phase, really preparation. It's talking to each other and sharing what is the UPR, exactly what I'm talking about with you today, sharing what rights they could raise, and more importantly, describing beyond what is wrong in the world we live in, but most importantly, what we want. It allows us to really be solutionaries and share specifically what are the questions we want to push to the government and what are the recommendations. All we have to do is link it up to any article in the UN Charter, anything in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and anything in the treaty bodies or anything a rapporteur, independent expert, and working group has said. So this also allows us in many ways, if you come to the permanent forum, you know after a couple of the people speak, you have to look up and say, what acronym was that? It allows us to educate all of our communities about the full field of human rights. And I know you appreciate that horn. That was a true New York moment. It's not the government's trying to censor us. It's just an angry person on 43rd. And so one of the exciting things is in a way, that's what we're good at. Most of us are good at honking the horn and shaming a government. But what we're trying to do is beyond naming and shaming, but framing and claiming our rights. So this phase of the preparation, I could say you could start, if you're really well organized, 18 months out. And the best way to think of this, and this is what I sort of described to the ambassador that I was meeting with, is you shouldn't think of it as, oh, the UPR is happening, I have to write a report. You should think of it as, what are we already prioritizing? What are the issues we brought to the permanent forum that didn't have a result in them? What are the issues that are happening right now that the world must concentrate on, but is being forgotten or ignored? This is the chance at the UPR to raise them and be as creative as possible. So the preparation, the most important thing is we write a 5-page document independently, individuals. So anyone in the world can write a 5-page document on these important issues. The other important part, though, is if you're working in coalition, such as a working group or on a specific thing, missing women and Indigenous girls, as that date is coming up tomorrow, we can actually turn in a 10-page document. So this allows us really to write and share with the world what's going on. And it's really important because it also allows us then to document what's going on, and it appears on the UN website. It goes on to the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it goes under each country. The other exciting part about that, though, is it also allows you to connect with other movements that are also working on similar issues, but also connect with more civil society movements in our countries to build a human rights coalition or genuine human rights movement from the ground. So the first phase is preparation, and that would conclude roughly 6 months out when you write your stakeholder report. And like I said, the exciting part is you can include so much in there. The other side, though, is being creative, right? Because not everyone loves writing reports. It's finals time, and a lot of people are writing reports, but the truth is, that's not what people like to do. So we actually even got creative and had a contest where people could actually make a video highlighting what human rights violations were taking place and what they wanted to be done. And that was exciting. We had farm workers, the Immokalee farm workers, which included many Indigenous people, talking about how you get the food on your plate when you go to any restaurant. And they're saying, we picked your tomatoes, we picked your lettuce. And it was, do you know where your food comes from and how it gets to you? Which was perfect. So that won the contest. So people, you could have a video contest, you could have an art contest, you have a spoken word. But the important part about human rights is it should be alive, it should be creative. It should be something that we all share, so we don't have to just do the reports. The reports are good because it is really good to crystallize your campaigns, but you can also be more creative. The second phase is interaction. And that's why it's important to meet with people. With the UPR, the people you're interacting with are ambassadors, are governments. So it's good to look at who cares about what issue you're bringing forward. There's a great way to cut through a lot of research hours, and that is the UPR Info website. UPR Info is an NGO, but they have this great database. So whatever issue you're working on, Indigenous children, Olelo, Hawaii, right? So it's the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages. You can find out which countries have become the champions, which one asks the most recommendations, which one makes the most questions. So you can actually organize and do that. The other side, though, what's really important in that second phase of interaction, after you identify which country you want to meet with, then you actually prepare a 1 to 2 pager. Just a 1 to 2 pager, very simple. And in that 1 to 2 pager, you say, this is the issue. So you cite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you cite the CERD. If you're using CERD, it's anything under Article 5. You can find it all there. It's almost every alphabet and letter, but it has civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Then you cite the question, because we know if we go to the Capitol, if we know if we meet with our local city officials, that usually we don't get the response we need. So this is a chance for governments of the world who care about the issue you've already identified to then ask your question in front of the entire world, live webcast, and then put some pressure on them. So this is a very important process. The second phase, I would say, goes all the way up to the evening before the UPR. I've had a great friend, a Maasai from Kenya, who showed up the day before their UPR and is like, I'm here, I'm ready. Isn't this exciting? But we had not talked for 6 months. And I was like, oh my God, you're here. This is great. But we had 1 month to get these questions and recommendations into the hands of government. And the exciting thing is, even with the night before, although I don't recommend it, we got up to 6 recommendations. So up till then, the exciting part is during the consideration phase, which is it takes place for 2 weeks and 14 countries are reviewed, you can do one more side event. The other thing we've done as well in the interaction phase, though, before we move on, is interaction phase, you can host a meeting in a couple of places. You can host it in Geneva at the Human Rights Council at the session before. You can go to the pre-session and speak there, but you also could do it in New York if you're closer to New York, inviting the UN missions. And you also could do it in the capital if your country is not aggressive, violent nation. You can host a meeting for all the embassies, and they would appreciate that because most embassies are keeping track of human rights in each country, but they don't know where to get all the information. They're not out in the community enough. So what we do in this phase of interaction is we come to the capital or to New York or Geneva where the UN missions are, and we spoon feed them exactly what those issues are, what the questions are, and what recommendations we want them to make that will then improve human rights on the ground and make a difference in your daily life. So that's the important part. The third phase is the consideration. That's the actual 3.5-hour review. The good news is you don't have to go to Geneva. If you get to Geneva, that's great. You make the most of it. You have a side event. You connect with people. You talk to governments. But if you're not able to go, you host a viewing party, very much like rugby if you're from the Pacific, or football and soccer if you're from the rest of the world. Like when the World Cup's coming up or the UEFA finals, you get a big video screen and you can all watch your country being grilled. It's around lunchtime here, so you make a state sandwich. You pushed up for all those months and all the international system exists, and you sort of make a state sandwich and squeeze the truth like a panini out of the government. And so this 3.5-hour session, it'll begin with the government. The government will say, hello, it's an honor to be here. We take our obligations so serious. We've done these things before we've come, usually not enough. And then the other governments get to ask questions. Usually up to 120 up to 130 of the 193 can sign up and ask a question or make a recommendation. Then usually after a couple dozen have spoken, the government might respond and give an initial suggestion or conclusion. Then what's so exciting is then it goes back to more and more countries, more and more recommendations, as well as questions. Then the government responds. And then this is the exciting part. With a lot of the work we do, we're not sure if we're successful. Like if the permanent forum, how do we measure success? I guess the good news is you get selected on the list and you're able to make an intervention. You record it, you're able to share it on social media. Maybe a UN agency hears what you said. It says, we'd like to partner with you as UNICEF or UNESCO or World Health Organization. Maybe another government says, we worked on that issue in our country, we'd like to assist. But it's very hard to scale. The good news is at the UPR, anything that is said, any recommendation, any question provided goes into the final report. So we know right then, we were successful. We got 4 recommendations. We got 3 questions. We were able to see an impact from just working for this 1-year time period in the preparation and interaction. So that's exciting. What's really important too also though is you can also organize at the country level, either viewing parties, but you can also tell the government to also host one in the capital. So more and more people are aware of the UPR. We don't want it to be a secret that a country's having a UPR. We want everybody to be able to contribute and be talking about human rights. We know every day people talk about GDP. We want to know what Kim Kardashian wore to the Met Gala, but we don't focus on human rights and how it's going. It's never mentioned enough. And so this is our chance to make human rights hot and sexy and the topic of the town. And so we have to do that. The adoption is the 4th phase. That happens at the next Human Rights Council session. So the next UPR that'll be really important will actually take place in October, November. And then the good news is we have some months. We have until the February, March Human Rights Council session at the adoption. The adoption is important for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, the government will have an hour and 10 minutes to come and say what they accept from what was stated to them. Most also would like to come and say, this is what we've done in the 4 to 6 months since we last met. So what's important in the adoption phase is for you to go home, try to get a meeting with the government, try to have your proposals and your practices and your new policies ready, and push them to say, you want to look good at the adoption, saying you did something, that you heard the world, you heard what they mentioned, and you've taken action. So that's the most important. But the other exciting point is you can sign up and speak. There are 10 speaking slots of 2 minutes, so you can then have the final word. And this is the aspect of the UPR, if you think of it in its holistic phase. You write the first report that frames and claims what your rights are, and then in the end, you give an assessment. This was done. This wasn't effective. The government has ignored us. In fact, yesterday, 2 people were arrested who participated in the UPR. This is your chance to grade the government and tell the world what's going on. So that's a really good one, grade the government. And that's what is possible. And so that's the adoption phase. You get to sign up and speak if you have ECOSOC status, or you can ask someone to sign up and speak then under their name. And the final phase is implementation. And this is what matters most. We got to think of the implementation from the beginning. What is it that matters? And then we're able to then implement all those recommendations that were given. And the exciting part now in the implementation phase that will also relate to our final topic we discussed today is the Sustainable Development Goals. What the High Commissioner for Human Rights does is they take every recommendation, they actually put it in translate it from the UPR recommendations of human rights into the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and say, this is what you have to do. The reason I think of it is we have to think of all these mechanisms as interconnected. If UPR went really well, you don't have to go, oh, I did a great job and I'll come back in 5 years. Hopefully the government will do something. No, you look for specifically the next human rights treaty body review, which we're going to get into, or you look at the important aspects of the voluntary national review or the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So in a way, you don't lose momentum. You don't go, oh, I'm done. You look at what's next and what's possible. And the other important part before we get into the treaty bodies is the Human Rights Council in general. It meets 3 times a year. It meets in February, March. It meets in June, and it meets in September. So in the September session, they look at indigenous issues. So I know it's hard to go 3 times a year, but you can just go to the September one or go to the session before your UPR. And the good news is you also don't have to fly. During COVID, I did it all virtually, and we actually stayed at home and attended and then communicated with governments and proposed things to move forward. So you do not have to travel as much, and it's even better post-COVID that you can be effective from home. You can keep your issue alive. It's difficult to advance, but you can even advance. We were able to even push for the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights during this time. So anything is possible. It is so exciting. And so that is the UPR. So if you have any questions on that part, be like, ooh, part 1, that's what I want to raise. The second part, and we'll go through this so we have enough time to discuss, is the treaty bodies. So that's civil, political, economic, social, cultural, racial discrimination, torture, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, then looking at Convention on the Rights of the Child, migrant workers and their families, enforced disappearances, very unfortunately happening too often in Latin America with the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and the last one, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So those 9 treaty bodies are experts. They exist of experts between 10 members on the Committee Against Torture, all the way to 23 members on the CEDAW for women's rights. The good news is, unlike the UPR, we don't have to lobby 193 countries. You have that list of 10 to 23 experts, usually 18, and you can see what they care about. They're usually professors, they're usually activists like yourself, and then you're able to then share with them your report. So I'll give you an example of CERD, but you can apply it to anyone. So the committee on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, CERD, will be meeting in August. They'll review the United States. It's a pretty big issue when you look at George Floyd, when you look at land back and different indigenous peoples able to put pressure on governments with more land acknowledgements, with all that's going on racial discrimination. It's one of those that you could get as excited as that siren going on behind me. And so one of the things that you can look at is, when are the deadlines? So it's just like the other, there's 5 phases. The preparation. So in the preparation, you're creating a shadow report. And you can do it 2 ways. You can, 1, look at what the government's turned in, or 2, and you could do document by document, but you could also just write what you care about, citing specific articles of that treaty. So Agnes did a great job putting all the acronyms of those treaties there. You could say, ooh, under CEDAW, under CERD, bum, bum, bum. And like I said, under CERD, every human right is almost mentioned under Article 5. So you can all be attorneys now, and you could go to any government saying you're violating Article 5 under the CERD, and I'm pretty sure there's an article for that. And so we have time to write our reports. Our shadow report is due July 15th. So one of the things we're doing is actually having consultations. We're having consultations, because governments don't do it enough, among ourselves, of what do people care about, asking the people, talking to people. So it's a great chance to say and speak to directly impacted peoples. What are your priorities? What do you want? And then we draft the best recommendations. If we draft the recommendations exactly as you want them, you, everyone on this call, you are the experts of your country. Those experts are amazing at the treaty. They are very passionate about human rights, but they can't cover the human rights of every country. So it's a partnership. We're building bridges. And when you give them that information, that knowledge, that is phenomenal, because you're making their life easier, but you're also spoon feeding them the specifics that then allow them to do their job better. Because governments are going to try to say they're doing everything, but you can do that, and then you can be able to share. So that's very important as we go through that. I did see that there's a midterm. The sad part is it's not really focused on enough. After 3 cycles, there's only been a handful of countries that really do midterms. So that's one thing that we can concentrate on. But I wanted to provide with you all the different things that you can engage in and how you can do that and be able to have your voice heard. So the exciting part is, of those 9 human rights treaty bodies, most governments have at least ratified half. So that means throughout the time, you can then see and look on the OHCHR website if your country is being reviewed. You turn in your stakeholder report, and then you get to interact. You go to Geneva, or you could email them at their universities prior and tell them these are the questions that will really get to the bottom of what they're trying to do regarding that racial discrimination, right? So that's absolutely important. The other part is there are briefings, but even more important, you get to speak. You get to speak at the consideration. So at the interaction, you do everything you can to connect with them prior, but at the consideration, when the session starts, they split up into 2 weeks, and it's like 7 countries each week. On the opening day, they split up the time between everyone that submitted the stakeholder report. So the stakeholder report, you should write it because it saves your space. It's a space saver that holds your spot to be able to speak in Geneva. The other important part is you get to then split the time and be able to talk directly to the experts. Normally, if you give a great presentation, sometimes at the Perma Forum, people come up to you and they want your card or they want to take a picture. Here, they will come up to you with specific questions, with follow-up, asking if they can then receive more information. So you know if you're being successful, and you know what you're saying if you're connecting with. The other exciting part is you can also do what we always do here, side events, and you can brief them. And so the reviews usually, like the UN calendar, this year it's been a little funky, right? It's 9 to 11 and 3 to 5. But normally the UN is consistent 10 to 1, 3 to 6. And the 1 to 3 is always side events, such as this amazing one we're doing here today. And it's the same there, from 1:15 to 2:45 in the Palais Wilson, the one right on the lake. You can host a side event and meet with the experts. And they love that because in a way, they're almost like students. They're last minute cramming, or just really smart, right? If I'm about to go into a meeting in a battle with the government to say how they're doing on human rights, I want to meet with civil society and talk to them right before. I want to go meet them and I want to say, hey, what's going on? What is this? I've read these reports last night as I was preparing for today and my questions, but I want to know, has this person been released? Or what's the situation? Has this statistic improved? What is your perspective? So really, information is the currency, and your credibility is based on the accurate information you can provide to them clearly during that side event prior. Then the actual consideration, the exciting part, it's 5 or 6 hours long. So it's really hard for a government to fib or lie all that time. We were able to then really dig deep. If you make connections with these experts, they'll give you their email. You can send them follow-up questions. And this is really the exciting part, is we can then coordinate campaigns and then really put pressure and make the government squirm, make them show they don't know what they're talking about, make them show that they're not giving all the facts. So that consideration, the 5 to 6 hour review, really does allow us to present and provide so much information on a specific theme. It allows you to drill really deep and to be specific. So that's the exciting part, because it's on women's rights, or it's on racial discrimination, or it's on children's rights. It allows you to really concentrate. And that's the treaty bodies. The exciting part is they've started to do follow-up as well. So after you have the review, the consideration, in 2 weeks, there'll be an adoption of the report. You can host press conferences. You can see in 2 weeks how successful you were. And then it's the final phase of implementation, just like the UPR, where you really do push to get the government to do what they promised in Geneva. And more importantly, there's a follow-up mechanism where there's 1 year. Countries are reviewed, as was shared earlier by one of our colleagues. There's a midterm review under UPR, but what's really exciting here under this is many of those committees have created 1 year reviews of either 2 issues or 4 issues that they need the government to respond back to. And then in different things, sometimes they'll say it's not accurate enough. Sometimes they'll give them a grade, just like they're in school. So this allows you to say, you don't want to get a failing grade. You should do this because you already promised you would, but you haven't done it. So in a way, this allows us to always be squeezing that state sandwich and coordinating together and to do that. And we wish we had a panini here because it's a little cold in New York this week, a little rainy today, not quite the Hawaii weather or many of the beautiful locations you all are from, but that's why we need to apply the heat. So the government feels us and knows that we're serious and that we don't just come to the permanent forum and then go home with some souvenirs, but that human rights is life and we're dedicated to this. And we'll use all the instruments of the UN as well as the regional bodies to make sure the world lives up to its obligations. And what's really good about cultural survival is they work really well at the Inter-American Commission. There's also the African, and there's also the European Court of Human Rights. So we can also look at that, but that's another presentation. Finally, it's the Sustainable Development Goals, the Voluntary National Review, and the DNR at the High Level Political Forum. And I'll be very brief because it follows the same pattern. The 17 goals are no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender justice. Then you're looking at the importance of clean water, sanitation, renewable energy, decent work, innovation infrastructure, and looking at those important aspects of what's reducing inequalities in renewable energies. Then you get into the human rights city model or sustainable communities in cities. Then our own actions, right? Responsible consumption and production. How are we living, right? You don't want to contribute to these giant stacks of garbage on the streets of New York at night. You want to be producing as much waste, as least waste as possible, and thinking the most about how you can contribute to a circular economy. Then, of course, you have climate action, life below water, life on land, all important, of course, for us in our indigenous world. Then peace, justice, and strong institutions, number 16. And 17 is partnerships. It's all about partnerships. And the good news about the Voluntary National Review is it allows us to really focus on human rights through the global goals. I call it human rights light. But most countries want to participate. 40 plus countries sign up every year to appear for the review. Let's talk about the weakness, though. The weakness is it's a 30-minute or a 20-minute review, way too short. But the other side is we can organize. So it's not like the UPR where you have to wait till the adoption at the 4 months later. we can actually do the same thing that we do. We write our reports. We turn them in a month before. So it's every July that happens. So end of May, early June, you want to have a report written on the global goals in your community. And you want to identify, if you can, the promising practice, what's the best thing and what you want more of. But the other is you can also say what is wrong, but some small steps to set that course right for the SDGs. And we only have 8 years for the SDGs. So this is really our chance to organize. And there's some important language in the Voluntary National Review and in the SDGs. Number one, it is leave no one behind. That means Indigenous peoples must be included, and we can coordinate along those lines. Number two, furthest behind first. So unfortunately, we know Indigenous peoples usually lead in the indicators that we don't want to lead in. And these are all direct correlations to colonization. But it's the example of poor health. It's the example of not grading well. It's all those things that have really been inflicted intentionally by the empire and the colonial system. But this SDG, we have 8 years during all of these VNRs to put pressure on our country to actually achieve the 2030 agenda. And so that is important to look at what we can do and how we can do that. And one thing we're doing at the Permanent Forum is we should be meeting every year as Cultural Survival or a whole coalition. We can have that meeting like we have in Geneva prior to the review. The exciting part is the Permanent Forums is in April. So this is our chance to have a big event, and every Indigenous people who is being reviewed at the VNR in July, just 3 months away, we can speak to all the governments and say, hey, we know you've asked questions about climate change. Hey, we know you've asked questions about peace, justice, and strong institutions. This is great. So we can look then at what's possible and how we can do that. And so what's really important as we go forward is it's that 17 partnerships. It's working with everyone we know and new partners that just arrived and saying, this is what we care about the most. So these are some examples of what you can do in the UPR. You can do a shadow report. You can be creative. We've translated the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17, into local goals in the sense that we've made drawings. And those 17 figures are great. They look like a Rubik's Cube, but we've taken those and then turned them into Hawaii designs. We also turned it into Olelo Hawaii and translated it into the indigenous language of Hawaii, and also created even more logos for each one. So you can really localize and indigenize and bring the SDGs on the ground and do the global goals on the ground. So I'll stop there, and I hope we have enough time for questions, but it was great to cover all three, and I appreciate all of your participation. If you're still here, find me either in the UN or, as you can see.
We're good on time, Joshua. So if you want a little bit more time to wrap up, that's fine. We're good on time.
No, I'm good. I did my best because I like more of a dialogue. So I know we have at least 12 minutes. So any questions or anything anybody has, we're here and excited to continue the conversation.
Yes, and thank you very much for that. I know it was a lot in the amount of time that we gave you to elaborate on each of these three mechanisms. That's the UPR, the treaty bodies. You can spend an entire year learning about this in law school, right? So we're putting all of this in 30-minute segments, and it's a lot. But I like that. I like the recommendation that you made in respect of, it's not just about complaining about these human rights violations, but it's also framing and claiming our rights. So that's Joshua's words. And I think that's very powerful because we're moving from a place of shaming or complaining to beyond that, and to being more assertive in respect of how we want to ensure that our rights are being recognized. So that is great, Joshua. And again, the UPR is a very good way of, even if your recommendations aren't being adopted, it's also a good way to get publicity on these issues on the ground. And I always say, even if you're not getting the response that you need, I think at some point you will. And so it might not be from the experts that you're trying to target, but it could be that you're educating your own communities of these issues, and trying to, in that way, you're asserting your rights locally, you know. And so I like your ideas in respect of the side events, you know, using those tools to brief the experts on these issues, because you're absolutely right. In the limited time that you have, they need time to also educate themselves on these issues. So those are great ideas. And again, thank you. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but we're now opening up the floor for folks that are attending. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and we can take questions now.
Yeah. And if there isn't one, I'll just add one quick one, because I really thought those were great points, Monica, because you can also organize your campaign. Like, this is the best education. Because it's not just to say, hey, do you want to learn about human rights? Most people are like, oh, yeah. But you're like, this is happening in a year. This is happening in 6 months. And it really brings everyone together. But like you said, it's planting the seeds that then grows, that you can use when they're trying to build a telescope on your Mauna. You know, it really does create community. And then the last part, as you said, we also can do campaigns. So we did hashtag campaigns, and we did, you know, realize my rights, you know, hashtag, and that was before adopt my rights, adopt my recommendation. So, you know, you can be using and organizing, and it's a chance to put pressure on the government at every level, at the federal, at the national, at the local, and the city. So we've utilized that really well. And then the other side, like you said, is then you can actually put pressure at all levels. So we did hashtags for your Senate, for the mayors, for governors, to then push at every point, and then wrote the recommendations that would then tell them how to achieve what they promised to achieve. So, you know, sometimes, as you pointed out, was really good with the experts. We have to educate them because they're really good, but never forget this: you are the expert of your people. No one knows you better than you. You know, some people say, oh, I feel imposter syndrome, or I'm here at the UN, I don't know if I belong. We all belong. In fact, the UN couldn't work without the civil society, without the NGOs, without the indigenous peoples, because we're living the human rights experience and we know what truly is going wrong because we live it. So they are so excited to hear from us. So don't ever feel like, oh no, you know, sometimes you don't want to start with in 1642, you know, you want to give them the most important facts, but they really do rely on us. We're the oxygen for the UN to function well. And so it's always great to meet everyone. And I appreciate all of the comments in the chat so far.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Joshua. I think that a lot of times we are the experts because we, after all, are on the front lines. We're experiencing these violations, if you will, and we have firsthand knowledge. And I think that is so much more powerful than, say, some researcher researching about the issues on the ground, where you can come. These are your testimonies. You're saying, we're living this on a daily basis. This is my reality. This is my truth. Here, listen to me. Do something about it. Yes, hola. I see a hand raised. Raúl, you have a question? Muy buenos días, Raúl.
Mi nombre es Raúl Sajama. Actualmente yo soy vicepresidente de la comunidad indígena Angosto del Perchel en Jujuy, al norte de Argentina. En primer lugar, agradecer el temario que han desarrollado, porque es muy necesario en estos tiempos, más a la luz de los testimonios que se está escuchando en estos días en los distintos foros. Lo que yo quería plantear, con todo respeto, es la necesidad de empezar a abordar el incumplimiento de la consulta libre, previa e informada, el convenio 169, que está ocurriendo no solamente acá en Jujuy, Argentina, en las distintas provincias del Estado Federal de Argentina, sino también por los testimonios que se ha estado escuchando en los distintos países donde hay poblaciones indígenas. Yo creo que la situación es tan grave por cuanto no solamente para las áreas protegidas, para permitir que empresas extractivistas entren a territorios indígenas, para que empresas ligadas a la cuestión energética, hidrógeno verde y todas estas cuestiones, también todas estas cuestiones están produciendo el despojo de los territorios en lugares muy distintos y en distintos países. Yo creo que es un tema muy importante, por lo que yo me animo a proponer que sea un tema objeto de ser tratado por en las distintas regiones que es el mundo, porque esto es lo que está pasando. Pese a que hay legislaciones, los países, en el caso de Argentina, han adherido, está vigente el convenio 169 en este país, han adherido a la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, y sin embargo es como si fuera letra muerta. Ya no basta con pedir respeto, ya no basta, digamos, con hacer una demanda, un juicio. Yo creo que la situación está tan grave que es como que nos estuvieran desconociendo los estados, invisibilizándonos, y todo con las intenciones de producir el despojo de los territorios indígenas, ¿sí? Eso sería mi propuesta a los señores, digamos, de este foro, con la idea de que lo trasladen al otro ámbito principal, y si me corresponde y si puedo pedir, sería solicitar que este foro efectúe una recomendación al Estado de la provincia de Jujuy en la República Argentina, recomendándole se cumpla la consulta previa, libre e informada del convenio 169, así como también se cumpla la Declaración de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas de las Naciones Unidas. Nada más, muchísimas gracias. Y si puedo aportar en algo o colaborar en algo, encantado. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Raul, for that intervention. We appreciate it. And we have placed Joshua has his email in the chat. So feel free to reach out to us, and at CS, maybe we can talk some more and see how we can collaborate further. Thank you. I see another hand raised up, and that is Kenneth. I will ask somebody to unmute you. You have the floor, Kenneth. If you can unmute yourself, I'm not sure if you can do that, but maybe Agnes, one of our tech people, can help with that.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, I'm happy to join this webinar. My name is Kenneth Studiambona. I work as the Executive Director of Batwa Community Development Organization in Uganda. The human rights here in Uganda that my community is facing is alarming. The Batwa Pygmies were evicted from their ancestral lands, which is the national parks, in 1991. And they were not actually consulted, compensated, even resettled. Since it is now more than 31 years that these people have been suffering. And in the communities that we are living, we are just scattered, living here and there, and the torture is very high, killings. Recently, I witnessed my fellow Batwa being killed when they go back to the national parks, like to collect firewood, to get what we used to eat. So when you go back to our the communities, the Batwa are harassing them, they beat them, for the young girls, they are not attending school, they are being raped, pregnanted, and when I try to report this, of course, nowhere we pass. So I'm happy to present this to the international community and people who are watching, who are listening.
Mm-hmm.
The situation is not good here. Thank you very much, Monique, for giving me this opportunity. I'm very happy for you and Cultural Survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. We really do appreciate you that intervention, and I would like to talk to you more about that situation on the ground. I know that the Batwa issue has been an issue that's been ongoing for a long time. And yes, we do. We feel for you and we hear you.
8 o'clock.
So thank you very much for that. So Joshua, I think there was probably one question in the Q&A tool. It's in Spanish, so maybe I will have one of our interpreters read that to us. Thank you.
Thank you. You want me to try to bring those three together, Monica?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it is wonderful to hear from Argentina, as well as Uganda, and also in the most recent example that you just shared with us. I think what's important and what we could look at is, first and foremost, with Argentina, I believe you're also talking about ILO Convention 169. And ILO Convention 169 also has a tripartite method that we can actually bring issues to the ILO in Geneva. So I think we've talked about the UN today, but since you did mention ILO 169, it's good for us to know that that is possible and it's not utilized enough. So we could definitely do that for the 24+ countries that have ratified the ILO Convention 169. We can use that mechanism. And that's very, very important. They have a big session every June in Geneva. And it's also true that talking about free, prior, and informed consent, we could also have a conference that we look at free, prior, and informed consent and try to find the best examples. Because if we could see where Indigenous peoples have come up and created models where if a corporation or if a government shows up, you actually have a process that you've established on how you interact with them, that there's a 6-month review period, that that you have other NGOs you partner with to put pressure on if they show up with military or police and militarize the situation. But have been many communities that have come up with really strong models in horrible autocratic regimes and also in more democratic regimes who also are very bad when they're trying to push through a development project. So that's a couple points there. And Argentina also does ratify a lot of instruments. So I'll try to do a quick review, Raul, of when Argentina is coming up next, and we can see what's possible going forward. I know cultural survival is great and they're very busy all the time, but that's one thing. And about the example in Uganda, it's true. We have to be able to then maybe invite special rapporteurs from the Human Rights Council. You can always contact one of the 45 special rapporteurs and they respond rapidly. They're not something you have to wait to connect with. So Kenneth, on that situation and what you've described with us, you can find out which of the rapporteurs under thematic procedures on OHCHR website that match, and then write them letters and connect. And then on the final example, I think that's also very important that Cultural Survival has done an amazing job. We had a series of articles that we've edited that also simplified. So it's great that you said it's great to see it in a manner that's not academic, that's accessible. But we've also done articles that are 2 pages. And of course, Cultural Survival has the best layout and design. It's great to see it in person again at the UN. But you can see each treaty. I think we've covered all of them. And then also at different mechanisms, what is possible and how you can participate, as well as MRIP and the Permanent Forum. And we always have wanted to, and maybe we'll find a great fellow at Cultural Survival and we can maybe put them in one place in one spot. And we also wanted to make a chart, because not everybody's just reading oriented. Maybe we can make a chart or make short videos that's a little smaller or less time than this meeting today, but where we cover each treaty body, and it's a way that you can just come and watch and then see what's happening and then go to the article and go to the graphic chart. So you inspire us every time we meet, and you give me great ideas of how we can move forward and what we can do to then make all of this information available so you can have a greater impact on the international human rights institutions.
All right, thank you very much, Josh. And I think that's probably it for questions. Let me just quickly check if there's any more in the chat. I don't see any more. And so I think that we're given our time constraints, we should probably end here. But again, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. It's a lot to digest, but it's very important. And I'm very grateful to you for imparting that knowledge on us. You're very well versed in this area. And so we thank you for giving us your time. And we hope that you continue to enjoy the rest of your time at the Permanent Forum. And as you all are doing very good work and necessary work. And for all the folks out there that joined us, again, thank you for your contributions. Thank you for the work that you continue to do in order to amplify Indigenous people's rights. Again, have a great day and many blessings.